as you probably have seen from our advertising and all of the social media and other discussions leading up to this meeting, this is really a new kind of scientific meeting for us here at Ohio State, and we're really excited that you could join us today. I'm Philip Payne. I'm the chair of the Department of Biomedical Informatics. I also lead our campus-wide data analytics initiative, and I'm the associate director of the CCTS for data sciences. So I wanted to just take a minute before we launched into the program and tell you about why we created this new type of meeting. And really, BRUTx is about reconceiving our way of telling the story of how science has impact in the world around us. And as you saw in the advertising, in the programs, and other discussions, we really oriented the meetings program around three main areas. We talked about innovation, implementation, impact. And we really see this as sort of the spectrum of clinical and translational science, from how we discover new approaches to promoting health and wellness, to how we actually put them into place in the real world, and then understand their impact and what makes them successful in turning the needle in human health and disease. And so what you'll hear today are a series of speakers that are going to attempt to tell the story both scientifically and in terms of these sorts of impacts around us as to how we can develop these innovative approaches, how we can really understand how they make a difference around us, and how we can demonstrate that impact in a way that makes sense to the community beyond the immediate research environment, beyond the university. And I think this is a really exciting way to think about clinical and translational science, and then it gives us an opportunity to see the full spectrum from what we do in our labs to how it impacts individuals, their families, and communities. And that's really the focus of today's presentations, and I hope at the end of the day you'll come away energized and thinking more critically about how we can approach our research and innovation agenda across this type of spectrum. Before we get into the program, I also want to take a moment and thank our speakers. As I indicated at the start, this is really a new format of meeting for Ohio State. And these speakers, in many ways, were sort of on the vanguard of establishing this type of meeting. As you'll hear from each one of them, they have a story to tell about innovation and implementation and impact. And they all went through a very laborious process of proposing these talks and being coached and developing the presentations they're going to hear today. So I'd just like to take a moment and thank all of our speakers for their hard work, because without them, this program wouldn't be what it is as you're going to see today. So please join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers. I also want to take a moment, while I'm standing up here on this giant white X on the stage, and I'm a person that normally likes to pace when I talk, but I was told I'm not allowed to, so I'm at risk of sort of milling in a circle. But nonetheless, I want to take a moment and also thank the organizing committee. So while I'm the one standing up here talking about how fantastic this event is, it would not have happened without a number of individuals who put in countless hours to organize this entirely new format of meeting. So I want to just take a minute and recognize those individuals if they're in the room. I know Elliot's here. Maybe they could stand up. So Elliot Bendeley from the business school. Cynthia, I know I saw Cynthia. Please stand up. Jeff, is Jeff here? Jeff's here. Stuart Hobbs. Tim, unfortunately, had a last-minute conflict and had to travel internationally, which seemed like a relatively good reason not to be here. And then Pam. Is Pam in the room? So, and then lastly, while he's backstage, and you're going to hear more from him today because he's going to be our Masters of Ceremony, our meeting coordinator, Anton Johnson, has really been sort of the cornerstone of building this meeting. He's put in more hours than any of the rest of us combined. He's done an amazing job, and he's a huge asset to the university and the CCTS, and you'll hear more from him today. But if you see Anton, I hope you'll come up to him and thank him for all of his hard work in organizing what was arguably a very complex endeavor to establish BRUTx. I also want to take a moment and thank all of our sponsors. I will not name them all because that would be boring if I read the list of sponsors, but I will say that this is a fantastic group of entities both within the university and importantly outside the university, that when we presented them with the opportunity to support this event, to help make this sort of storytelling around the impact of translational science possible, they came forward not only with their ideas but their checkbooks and said, yes, this is something we want to be part of. And so I'm very, very grateful to all of our sponsors for helping to support this great event. And again, if you see representatives from our sponsors here today, I hope you'll take a moment and thank them for their generous support. This is sort of a rough breakdown. You should have gotten an agenda when you came in, but the general sort of layout of today is that we'll have a series of multiple blocks of presentations that will focus on the various themes I talked about, innovation and implementation and impact, and each one will be a series of stories at all levels across the research spectrum. We also have a networking lunch in the middle of the program. We have an opportunity to talk with your fellow meeting attendees as well as to interact with our speakers. At the end of the day, I really encourage you to stay for an event that we'll be conducting with our coach that worked with all of our great speakers, and you'll get to know her this afternoon, that will give you sort of what I like to describe as the abbreviated elevator speech version of many of the important lessons that our speakers that you'll hear from and ideally be impressed by today were able to benefit from during the coaching process. And then at the end of the day, we have what we call a speaker speed mingle. Think of it like speed dating, but with our speakers. And this will be an opportunity to interact with individuals that you might have a common interest with based upon what you hear from them today. And so again, this is a great chance to sort of connect the dots between what you hear on this stage and sort of your personal, professional, and scientific networks as you synthesize the lessons learned from many of these great stories. And so with that, I want to take a moment and introduce the director of the Center for Clinical and Translational Science, Dr. Rebecca Jackson, who's going to lead off today and give us an update on the state of the CCTS and its future direction. So with that, I'll turn over the stage to Becky.
Good morning, and go Bucks. So I'm really pleased to be here today. I'd certainly also like to add my thanks along with Philip, not only to all of those people that were involved in the creation of what I think is going to be an incredibly exciting day, thinking about really how translational science impacts you and your view of the world. But in fact, to all of you for attending and being willing to kind of stretch beyond your normal boundaries to think about impact. So about 150 years ago, many of you may remember that the Morrill Act was created. And that was really to create this network of universities that would actually advance the idea of higher education. Well, in the last 2 decades, the traditional land grant mechanism has actually changed. And rather than focusing just on creation of agriculture, engineering, and the teachers, the doctors, and the nurses that actually supply the entire state of Ohio, we've gone from a group of disseminators to, in fact, a group of creators of new knowledge. And nowhere was it more succinctly said than actually Gordon Gee about a decade ago when he came back to be the second time president of the university, when he said that as a land grant institution, the Ohio State University has a mission to translate knowledge as a sacred social compact. And I think that if we think about that today, think about the collaboration, the discovery, the team engagement that's necessary to actually meet this very noble goal, we'll really understand why all of us are here today in this room thinking about ways that we can do this mission better. And so we're really focused today on translational science. And over the last several decades, we've gone from really thinking about just the depth of discovery that each of us can do in our own laboratories to how do we take that information and move it forward from the laboratory to the bedside and then actually to implement that in the community to ultimately improve human health. And in fact, we've thought for a long time about this as a unidirectional process, that we actually move things forward in a linear process and hand them off to the next group of investigators to actually take that invention, move it forward at the bedside, and then move it forward to how we implement that. But in fact, we've started to realize that in fact it's not a unidirectional, it is actually bi or multi-directional. So in fact, we learn from our patients, we learn from the community, what are the greatest needs. So there really are stakeholders in thinking about this. And they help us to really pose those types of questions that we then can take back to the bedside or take back to the laboratory and then move those advances forward in the opposite direction in order to actually ultimately improve human health. There is, however, a problem, and the problem of translational science is the fact that it is a very, very long and, in fact, often inefficient process. And so it's been estimated that it takes more than 17 years for a new advance at the bedside, for example, the Human Genome Project, to actually be translated to something that improves human health. And in fact, not only is there a very long period of time, but in fact the failure rate is high. So more than 98% of advances, in fact, are never translated to actually move things forward. So how do we do things better? How do we think about this? How do we work collaboratively in partnerships or in teams in order to be able to be more successful? Because what we're really talking about is actually curing that translational valley of death. And so you may often have heard about that valley of death, talking about from the laboratory to the bedside. Well, I'd suggest to you, in fact, there are two valleys of deaths associated with translational science. And that second one is actually that valley of death associated with taking things that we've proven work effectively. For example, diet and exercise for reducing weight. And get communities to understand, how do we implement that? How do we utilize that? Because as important as it is to develop new therapeutics and new biomarkers, we are really incredibly lucky that we have a huge number of very effective drugs that are available, or different lifestyle modifications that we can recommend to patients. But in fact, what we see is that individuals don't actually utilize those. So we've unfortunately done science not in partnership with our stakeholders, so sometimes we create solutions that in fact aren't addressing the primary problems for the community. And one of the goals of the Center for Clinical and Translational Science and the NIH Clinical and Translational Science Award Program is to begin to think about this differently, so that in fact we can improve these efficiencies and cross not one, but both valleys of death. And so the way that we do this is to really think about, what are the tenets of translational science, and what do we at the CCTS try to develop programs and infrastructure for that actually help you to be more successful. And the first of these is to recognize that in fact translational science is team science. So just like the Ohio State University Buckeye football team, we in fact as translational scientists also need to form our teams. And I think a really useful metaphor to thinking about this is in fact the stool. So if you think of each of us as an individual scientist, we're like a single leg in that stool, okay? We have great depth of knowledge in a specific area that we can contribute to moving forward our own scientific discipline. But how do we actually get the greatest value associated with that? And that's really those rungs that actually give the strength. And that, in fact, is what translational science is. It's that interconnectedness between those three very strong legs that allows us to actually not only move forward, but I would suggest actually logarithmically vault science forward, so that we're able to translate our scientific advances to things that are relevant to all of the stakeholders, that are novel or innovative, aren't always obvious, that are actually sometimes on the edge to make us think entirely new paradigms in new ways, and importantly, enabled. And I think this is really the strength of being part of the Ohio State University. As you know, we're the most comprehensive university on a single campus, and we now have 15 colleges that all ultimately are working together with one vision as one university to thinking about, how do we improve the human condition and our society. Well, I would suggest to you that, in fact, our greatest opportunities and the greatest innovations that we can have will actually occur at that juxtaposition, that intersection of different disciplines and domains. And that, in fact, is what translational science is all about, at bringing different perspectives to look at a problem, and in fact, not just being interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, but really successfully move into that concept of being transdisciplinary. That partnership, as I said, really has to extend beyond just us as scientists. So we traditionally have thought about kind of the left side of this bridge, of running that gap over from the bench to the clinic, and then running over that gap from the clinic to actually public health policy. And the partners that we have in each of those areas would be very different depending upon the area that you're tending to focus on. But I think down at the bottom, those fishermen are an absolutely critical part of the story, because that, in fact, are our patients and society, those people that in fact we're the most responsible for making a difference. How do we bring them into the mix and make them part of this entire translational spectrum? And I think, in fact, this isn't a new idea. What we hope today is, in part, that we're going to teach all of you to be design thinkers. So what, in fact, is a design thinker? And design thinking is a methodology that actually imbues the full spectrum of innovation activities with an understanding of what people want and what people need. So what does that say? The stakeholder is absolutely critical to thinking about how do we actually begin to move our science forward in ways that are useful. And in fact, Thomas Alva Edison had ideas that we're beginning to go back and steal today in the biomedical sciences, because his approach to solving problems was team-based. It was multidisciplinary. It made good business sense. It was efficient and effective at moving things forward. He was nimble in his responsiveness, and he was able to look at the entire spectrum. So his team didn't just start at thinking about what is electricity, but how do we harness this? How do we manufacture this? How do we actually create light in an entire ecosystem? And I think most importantly, what of all of us feel is, in fact, I think what he maybe more elegantly, or certainly more obviously said, which is hell. There are no rules here. We're just trying to accomplish something. And I think if you keep that in the back of your mind today as you listen to the BRUTx talks, what you'll see is 12 people who each are thinking differently about translational science and problems, but at the end of the day, each one of them is trying to accomplish something that ultimately improves the human good. So what are those features that are associated with actually being an enlightened change agent or a design thinker? And I think the first of those is empathy. And that empathy really is to look at work from the perspective of the end users. And at the Center for Clinical and Translational Science at Ohio State University, we've actually developed cores that can help to support you in that and to work together with communities, and that's a community engagement program. And in the last 7 years alone, we've had more than 140 research teams that have worked together with the CCTS and communities in order to actually be able to have that empathetic approach towards their science. The second would be integrative thinking, which is really looking at both the salient as well as the contradictory aspects of a problem, and then begin to think of innovative solutions to that. And we also have cores that we've developed that can help to support that, whether it be the study design team or the translational therapeutics think tank. We can help you build a team of people around you such that you can begin to think about your problems not only in a very directive fashion, but to think about what other possibilities might be available to think kind of more innovatively and creatively. Obviously, for everybody who's involved in science, probably the basic tenet that we all have is optimism. Because what we're assuming is that we can have at least one potential idea or solution where the ultimate outcome would be better than anything that's currently available. And in fact, isn't that what happens every time you go to the lab, anytime you see a patient, anytime you walk out into the community? You think, you know what, I can make a difference. If I just thought about that, or I just brought the right group of people together, maybe we can change an outcome, or maybe we can enhance the way that we do something. Obviously, experimentalism is also critically important, and that's really that relentless posing of questions and exploring the constraints to proceed in entirely new directions. So within this is really that concept of science on science. How do we come up with new methodologies, new approaches that will actually not only help your individual projects, but in fact that you can disseminate to other scientists to help them to think in a different way about the questions that they're asking. And we also have resources there, including those in both the preclinical, the clinical, and I would say in the community-based space that will help you to reach out for those. And then lastly, and again, I think something that you will hear repeatedly over the course of today, and in fact you heard from the BRUTx team, because this was required to put on this event as well, is that concept of collaboration and partnership. And it's collaboration across the entire spectrum of the activities, from the initial conception or the ideation all the way through the design, the conduct or implementation, and ultimately the dissemination, and then that bi-directional conversation of how do you utilize this information. As I said, what we consider our role is at the CCTS is as a catalyst who actually has a call of action to all of you as a community of clinical and translational investigators, and in fact as stakeholders, as individuals, to think about how can we work together to move translational science forward. We build all of our work together with partnerships between the colleges, other centers, the Comprehensive Cancer Center, and the Office of Research and at the university to really provide some of the foundational resources and infrastructure that are necessary to allow you to more efficiently move your ideas forward. But we then focus on kind of 3 pillars for this home towards academic translational science. And the first of those is to really train and cultivate the translational science workforce. And that, in fact, is one of the reasons that BRUTx is here today, is to actually use this as a way to think differently and expand and take the lessons learned from other individuals to think about how do you internalize some of those ideas in your own science. The second is to enhance scientific innovation. So it's really how do we come together and how can we catalyze that? And one of the ways that we do this through the CCTS is through our longitudinal pilot program. We're using both concepts like project management as well as workshops and funding that we can bring teams from that very early idea and then help them to translate and really move from that multidisciplinary team to that transdisciplinary team. And then the last, and maybe not the most interesting, but probably the most important, is really that of innovating the research process. So how do we make things more effective and efficient? So whether that be focusing on regulatory issues, or how do we run our scientific cores more like businesses and make them effective and easy to access, are all things that we do in collaboration across multiple groups to move forward, with the ultimate goal, of course, of creating an environment, creating a community of translational scientists. So how do we approach this and what do we think? And I'd suggest to you that another thing to keep in the back of your mind today, and really part of the central dogma as well of the CCTS, is the 3 Ds. So the first is to define. And it's absolutely critical for each of us individually as well as collectively to identify what are the most pressing challenges that are facing patients, society, and health today. And then what's the vision? Where are we trying to go? Because there's also often multiple pathways that we can take that will get us there. But which pathway is really the most innovative will result in the greatest benefit. And unless you can see the end, you might get lost and meander, maybe down a very lovely road, but not necessarily in the most rapid way of enhancing. The second E is for develop, and that within each of the studies that you do, you often come up with new approaches to try to get to where you're going. And that, in fact, is that methodologic science that we talk about. And so it's critical that we share that with each other in order not to reinvent the wheel, but in fact to logarithmically be able to move translational science forward. And that, of course, then comes down to that final D, which is disseminate. That many, many years ago, I heard Linus Pauling, who's certainly one of my heroes, talk about this incredible moment where he had just figured out the crystal structure of some organic compound, and he had to go to a cocktail party because he was getting an award. And in his pocket, he had this diagram of the crystal structure. And he said for a few minutes, he felt like he was the only person who understood the answer to this perplexing. And then he realized that it may be beautiful in his pocket, but it was going to be even more beautiful the next morning when he actually shared that with the scientific community. And that's the importance of dissemination, that we actually have to share our advances and create those bidirectional and multidirectional conversations and apply where appropriate as standards in order to be able to change things. So what should you do today as you listen to each of our BRUTx speakers and think about ways that all of you, we hope, can better engage within the CCTS? And so I'm going to give you a list of what I thought about as I kind of looked at the topics and thought a little bit more deeply about the things that I'm going to keep in the back of my mind about where I might personally want to move my own science forward. And the first is to set a worthy goal. And I think that it's important that the journey begin with a belief that the hypothesis shouldn't just be focused on the intrinsic beauty, ones that I've personally fallen in love with, but in fact that they ultimately result in the betterment for mankind, or in our approach in biomedical translational science, for the betterment of human or one health. I think the second is on the shoulders of giants. And remember that we didn't come here and start everything, that this is really based on a foundation of knowledge and information that precedes us, and we're continuing to add to that evolving increase of knowledge and information. The third and an important thing that you'll also hear throughout today is the importance of seeking and cultivating mentors. Because if you're really going to achieve excellence, it really helps to see excellence in action. So look around, okay, because that mentor isn't always somebody senior to you. That mentor can similarly be your students, your children, the other people that you come in contact with that actually begin to shape the kind of translational science you are. The next would be keep an open mind. And I really wanted to read this quote to you because I think it says it more effectively than I would have said it on my own. That novelties should not be rejected precipitously, that dissent should be tentative rather than unyielding. So it's important to keep that open mind, to look at things from multiple perspectives. So in fact, you don't throw out the great advance by being so tunnel vision on the direction that you thought your science should have gone. Or in the words of the great late Yogi Berra, I wouldn't have seen it if I didn't believe it. So we need to think differently. What about intellectual agility? To recognize a chance observation, a brainstorm, a concept that may have come from a different discipline or a technology that allows for a quantum leap. So today, it's all right to think and hear and get ideas from your speakers and then to internalize those and take those in ways that actually moves your own discipline and area forward. And then, of course, as every single one of us in this room and online through streaming know, this is a long, hard journey. And so you have to embrace the hard work because these achievements in translational science really reflect the persistence of all the individuals who are moving forward. So going back to the very smart tagline for this conference today, innovation, implementation, and impact. And in fact, a very close friend of mine would say that impact is something that's critical to all of this, because as he borrowed from Emerson, you can never pay back, so it's always critical to pay forward. Again, I'd like to thank all of you for attending today. I look forward to active discourses in our networking sessions, and for each of you keeping an open mind and being excited by the things that you hear by your speakers. I'd like to thank Philip for really thinking of the idea of BRUTx more than a year ago, and then he and the planning team actually realizing this in this event today. And again, to thank all of you. So the College of Engineering about 5 years ago created the vision in the bottom corner of this slide. And what this is pictures of literally tens of thousands of OSU faculty, students, and staff brought together into a composite picture that reflects, of course, that which is near and dear to us, the OHIO. And that, in fact, is what translational science is. Or in the words of Henry Ford, coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success. I hope all of you will be successful in your chosen aspects of translational science and that you'll have a wonderful day today. The CCTS is here to support you and to provide you with the resources that you need. Please feel free to always come to us, and we'll be there and help to find you the things that will make you the greatest success. Thank you.